NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
So, what is a biometric? Well, face recognition, as we just heard, is a biometric, but a biometric is any unique marker that identifies or verifies the identity of a person using an intrinsic physical or behavioral characteristic. And that could be face recognition, fingerprints is probably one of the oldest, DNA, palm prints, iris scans, voice, keystrokes, gait. All of these are either currently used or in development now. So let's talk a little bit about the history of biometrics. Biometrics are not new. We've been collecting mugshots since 1869. In 1879, a French police officer named Alphonse Bertillon devised a system of measurement so that you could categorize mugshots. In 1924, the FBI started its fingerprint database. In 1984, Alec Jeffreys coined the term genetic fingerprinting, and in 1986, it was the first time that DNA was used in a court case in England. In 1994, the federal government authorized a national DNA index in the United States. And today, as of 2007, it's kind of amazing, it took up until 2007, but now FBI automates almost all of its fingerprint comparisons. We've started to see the use of rapid DNA to identify people, which allows for very quick identification through DNA. It's a pretty new thing. As of 2017, this kind of DNA will be able to go into CODIS, so we'll start to see more and more of that. So the government is collecting tons and tons of biometrics. This is a chart showing the growth of DHS's collection of biometrics. They currently have information on 220 million unique individuals, and they process 350,000 fingerprint transactions every single day. DHS is building a brand new database called HEART, and that database will include not just fingerprints and face recognition-ready photos, but also iris scans, tattoos, voice data, DNA, all sorts of different things. They're, of course, not the only government agency that has a huge database of biometrics, the FBI. They claim that their next-generation identification database is the world's largest and most efficient electronic repository of biometric and criminal history information. And they do have 138 million fingerprints in the database and over 30 million criminal mugshots. Now, as Claire talked about earlier, 30 million mugshots is not all the FBI has access to, because of course they have access to our driver's license photos too. The other thing to know is that the FBI doesn't hold on to its data. It is very happy to share it with all sorts of different people. And in fact, it exchanges data with nearly, according to the FBI, 25,000 local, state, tribal, federal, and international partners. And that's both civil and criminal data. So what are we seeing in the future of biometrics? Well, financial institutions are already using keystroke identification when you log into your online bank account, and apparently they can identify a fraudulent user just by the way that somebody types on a keyboard within 10 seconds. We also see iris scanners being used. They can now identify us from 40 feet away, even if you're looking in a rearview mirror on a car. Gait recognition has been developed by in a few different parts of the world, but most recently in China. And the company that's developing this in China says that they can identify people based on their body shape and how they walk, which allows you to identify somebody as they are walking away from you. And the last thing I saw pretty recently was heart rate biometric. So you could identify somebody at a distance just based on how their heart beats. Now that's kind of an interesting one, because the researcher says, with the heart scan, there's no way to escape. Everyone is naked under this radar sensor. It's a nice quote. This is a pyramid developed by DARPA that shows sort of a ranking of biometrics. And you see at the bottom of the pyramid, these are biometrics we're already using to identify people. So it's the physical characteristics of yourself and also how you behave. That's like your keystroke stuff. But you can also see what they're looking for the future, trying to develop in the future, and that's to develop behavioral biometrics from your experiences. And that could be like where you've been, who you interact with, how you construct sentences, how you use language, all sorts of things like that. So the other thing with the future of biometrics, and we're already starting to see this, we're seeing multimodal systems. This has two meanings. At basic level, it means any technology that combines different types of biometrics, but there's sort of two ways that this is applied. The first is a database that stores and allows identification for more than one type of biometric. And you could think about your phone. If your phone allows you to unlock it using either your fingerprint or your face, it's a multimodal database. Now, it probably only has your fingerprint and your face, but that's still a database. The FBI's next generation identification database, which allows for the input of multiple types of biometrics, is also a multimodal system. But even, local law enforcement agencies have their own multimodal systems right now. But then the second form of a multimodal database or multimodal system is a system that uses multiple biometrics at the same time to identify somebody, and that can increase the accuracy of the identification in real time. So I have to add my scary slide to Claire's because, of course, China's surveillance system is possibly the future that we're looking at now. One Chinese commenter has said that using biometric recognition to maintain social stability and manage society is an unstoppable trend. He also said that it's great business. There are 200 million cameras already in China, and they're getting smarter. They use face recognition, as Claire mentioned, but they use it in conjunction with object recognition, license plate recognition, and soon to be gate recognition. China is selling this technology to other countries. That image in the lower, I guess your right, is actually an image of law enforcement officers in Cambodia being trained on China's technology. So what does this mean for real people's lives? Well, it's had a huge impact on the Uyghur community in northwestern China. This is a minority Muslim community, and they are already the most heavily surveilled community in the world. And it's really an effort to stamp out dissidents and to change beliefs among that community. This is a gentleman who escaped to the West, and he described what happened to his family. He was taken in with his family members and asked to provide, well, not asked, he was told to provide different forms of biometrics. So it wasn't just face recognition, it was face recognition taking an image of his face at all different angles. He also had to provide a voice sample, his fingerprints, and a blood sample for DNA. And this is being used, as I said, to keep people down. The UN and the US recently released a report that found that 1 million members of the Uyghur community are already being held in re-education camps in China. And they're being tracked using these surveillance systems. Well, unfortunately, we may have the development of China's surveillance system right here in our own backyard. Amazon is selling its technology to law enforcement agencies already, and they have met with immigration and customs enforcement officials to market their face recognition technology. They boast that their recognition program, which they call recognition with a K to make it look really kind of early Soviet, they say that recognition can be used for surveillance on a massive scale, like tracking people in real time, tagging over 100 people in a photograph, identifying people just walking down the street. It also has object recognition and license plate recognition, which makes it possible to identify people even when you don't see their faces. So newer forms of biometrics have really changed at least my thinking about what biometrics mean and how they can be used in society. And this is for a few different reasons. If you think about early forms of biometrics like fingerprints, we've been using them for so long that we have standardized ways of matching one fingerprint to another. So if you have a police officer run a fingerprint from a surface that they've picked up, you'll most likely come back with a one-to-one match, or at least something that they're telling you is a one-to-one match. But as the last panel mentioned, that's not what's happening with face recognition or many of these other biometrics. Instead, what's happening is you are getting a ranked list of candidates that might be a match, and oftentimes you're getting a percentage chance of whether that person is a match or not. Now, law enforcement is also calling this an investigative lead rather than an exact match, which in my mind sort of raises the question of, do we challenge these things differently based on what the terminology that they're using is and based on how the results are presented? I think another way that biometrics are changing is that they require monitoring over time to identify a person. So in the past, you could just take a fingerprint and it's just one moment in time. You could take a DNA sample, it's one moment in time, and the same with a face image. But if you're trying to identify somebody with their keystrokes or with how they walk, you actually need a recording of at least more than one moment in time. And I think the other big difference is that biometrics allow for monitoring over time. So the combination of the sophisticated biometric collection technologies along with very cheap cloud storage systems means that we can hold on to data for long periods of time, and we can collect more and more data. That means we can put cameras up everywhere, and using a big data system, you can find one person in an image and then track them everywhere else they went throughout their lives. And that's, I think, a huge change from how we've used biometrics in the past. So the last panel did a good job of talking about new ways to challenge the technology and the results. I wanted to throw out a few Supreme Court cases because we are a room full of lawyers, and it wouldn't be a CLE without some Supreme Court cases. These are the cases that really, there are not very many cases at the Supreme Court that cover the collection of identification and cover the collection of biometric data. So the first actually the only Supreme Court case where the court looked at the collection of fingerprints was in 1969, the Davis versus Mississippi case, where a guy was picked up purely to get his fingerprints. And in the case, the court looks at whether there was probable cause to arrest him, and the court really takes issue with that part of it, not with the fingerprinting. But they do mention that the arrest, just for purposes of taking the fingerprint, violates the Fourth Amendment. In Brown versus Texas, this was one of the earlier stop and identify yourself laws, and the court said, similar to Davis versus Mississippi, detaining someone merely to get them to identify themselves violates the Fourth Amendment. But then we get to the Heibel case, and in that case, another stop and ID law, the court says it's actually okay to stop and require identification as long as there is reasonable suspicion to support the stop. Maryland versus King was a DNA case that got up to the Supreme Court in 2013, and it was about the collection of DNA from arrestees. And I think the interesting thing about this case is that, so the court said, yeah, it's totally fine to collect DNA from arrestees because the cops are only using it to identify somebody, and the court didn't look at all of the data that is held, all of the information that is held in our DNA. The court just didn't care about that. We filed amicus briefs on that issue. Other people filed amicus briefs on that issue. We said, you can learn about somebody's genetic propensity to have a disease. You can learn about somebody's family history, who they're related to. Some people have said you can determine somebody's political beliefs based on their DNA. But the court ignored all of that. And what the court looked at in the Fourth Amendment search context was the fact that you're taking a swab of somebody's cheek. And Scalia had a dissent in this case that was pretty good, but it was still based on this trespass theory of you are trespassing on somebody's body. He recognized in his dissent that this is different from photographs. If you just take a photograph of somebody, you're not touching their body, and so it's not the same. And then we get to Carpenter. And I think that there were some factors in Carpenter that could really matter for biometrics collection today. And the court really looked at data differently in Carpenter than they did in Maryland versus King. These are some factors I think that could matter in biometrics cases. The fact that the data is detailed and comprehensive, that could, if we start to see face recognition tracking people places, even if it's in public, that factor in Carpenter could really matter. Also, technology that tracks everyone, not just suspects, and records that extend years into the past. I think the other important thing is that the court recognized there's some reasonable expectation of privacy in public and in data stored with third parties. So, just barely did it before it went to 16 minutes. Here's my email address. I'm sure you can all find it in the program. So, last one, thanks.